Good evening and welcome back to Starlight Sleep Tales. There are conquerors who arrive and pass through, leaving a trail of destruction and little else. There are conquerors who take territory and install themselves as rulers, but leave the underlying culture and language and institutions of the place they have taken largely intact. And then once in a very great while, there is a conquest so complete, so thorough, so transformative in every dimension of the society it falls upon, that the world on the other side of it is simply a different world. Not the old world rearranged, but something genuinely new carrying within it the seeds of things that the old world could not have produced. Tonight we are talking about one of those rare events, the Norman Conquest of England in 1066, and the man at the center of it, William, Duke of Normandy, later called William the Conqueror, is one of those historical figures whose career seems to exceed the normal scale of what a single human life can accomplish. Not because he was a military genius of the first order, though he was, and not because he was a ruthless and effective administrator, though he was that too, but because everything he did had consequences that multiplied across the following centuries into outcomes whose shape we are still living inside today. The English language you're hearing right now contains within it the Norman French that William's followers brought to England in 1066, layered permanently onto the Anglo-Saxon foundation that had been there before. The legal and constitutional traditions of England, and through England of much of the world, carried traces of what William built. The way that power and land and loyalty were organized in medieval Europe was after 1066 permanently inflected by the specific form that Norman feudalism took in England. One battle, one conquest, one extraordinary and violent and extraordinarily able man, and the world changed. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely what you come here for. And as always, I would love to know wherein the world you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights, let the room go soft. Find a comfortable position and let the breath slow down. You have nowhere to be, and let us go back to the middle of the 11th century, to a world that was about to change in ways that nobody inside it could fully see coming. The story of William the Conqueror begins not in England but in Normandy, a region of what is now northern France that takes its name from. The Norse settlers who were given it, or who took it, the distinction being somewhat academic in the context of Viking expansion in the early 10th century. The Normans were the Northmen, the descendants of the same Viking populations that had raided and settled England, Ireland, Scotland, and Iceland, who had been settled in Normandy since 911, when the Frankish king Charles the Simple, in an arrangement that had the quality of paying protection money with diplomatic cover, granted the Viking leader Rollo a substantial territory along the lower Seine in exchange for homage, conversion, to Christianity and the useful service of a now stationary Viking force defending the Seine Valley against the more mobile Viking bands that continued raiding up the river. The Normans who descended from Rollo's followers had within a few generations adapted to the Frankish environment with a thoroughness that is itself one of the more remarkable cases of rapid cultural transformation in the medieval period. They had absorbed the French language, replacing the Old Norse that their ancestors had spoken within roughly 2 or 3 generations. They had absorbed French Christianity, building churches and monasteries of the Romanesque style with a speed and equality that reflected genuine religious commitment as well as political calculation. They had absorbed the military culture of the Frankish aristocracy, the heavy cavalry, the castle building, the specific feudal arrangements of landholding and military obligation. And they had taken all of these things and pushed them further, developing them into a particular Norman synthesis that was simultaneously French and something more efficient, more organized, more aggressive than the Frankish norm. The Normandy that William was born into was a duché, a political unit governed by a duke who was technically the vassal of the French king, but who exercised in practice near sovereign authority within his territory. The relationship between the Norman dukes and the French crown was one of nominal subordination and practical independence, and the Norman dukes had been expanding their power and their territory with a consistent energy that the French kings found difficult to check. By the early 11th century, Normandy was one of the most organized and most militarily effective political units in northern France. Its duke's authority, enforced by a network of castles, maintained by a class of mounted knights whose military service was precisely defined by the feudal arrangements that linked each lord to his superior and projected outward by the Norman tendency to see opportunity and instability, and to follow that opportunity wherever it led to southern Italy, where Norman adventurers were in the process of carving out a kingdom from the Byzantine, Ian, and Muslim and Lombard fragments of that region, and eventually to England, where the specific circumstances of English politics in the 1060s would create the greatest opportunity of all. William himself was born around 1028, the illegitimate son of Duke Robert I of Normandy, and a woman named Heraviver who was the daughter of a tanner or perhaps a leather worker in Files. The sources are consistent about her humble origin and inconsistent about its specific nature. The circumstances of his birth were not concealed and were not shameful in the way that the term illegitimate implies in modern usage. Noble illegitimacy in the 11th century was a common enough condition, and illegitimate sons were regularly recognized by their fathers and provided for within the aristocratic system. But the stigma was real enough that William's enemies used it against him throughout his career, calling him the bastard in the specific sense that was intended to diminish and to wound. And the evidence of his character suggests that the wound landed and that it shaped the specific quality of his ambition, the ferocity of his determination to be taken seriously, to be acknowledged, to be not merely powerful, but undeniably powerful in ways that no one could dismiss. Robert I died in 1035 on his return from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, leaving the duché to the 7-year-old William in a document of succession that had the force of Duke Robert's personal authority and the weakness of a minor's inability to enforce it. What followed was one of the most dangerous childhoods in the history of medieval nobility, and the accounts of it, preserved in Norman chronicles, written a generation or two after the events, describe a decade of endemic violence in which the Norman aristocracy, freed from the firm hand of an adult duke, pursued its own feuds and ambitions with a viciousness that several times came close to killing the child who was nominally their lord. William's guardians died violently, several of them in circumstances that suggested assassination rather than accident. The boy himself was moved from place to place by loyal servants who slept across his doorway at night to protect him. The Norman duchy fractured into competing factions, each controlled by a branch of the ducal family or by the most powerful Norman lords, each pursuing its own interests at the expense of any coherent ducal authority. William survived his childhood through a combination of luck and the loyalty of a small group of supporters. But the specific episodes of that childhood deserve more than summary, because they illuminate the specific texture of the danger he navigated and the specific character that emerged from navigating it. The guardians who died included Osbor of Crelon, one of the most important of the early supporters, killed in the boy William's own chamber by a member of the Montgomery family. During an internal noble quarrel, the murder committed, according to the tradition, while Osborne slept across the doorway he had positioned himself to guard. A scene of domestic violence and personal loyalty killed in the same moment. Another guardian, Count Alan of Brittany, who had been assigned the boy's care by the King of France, died suddenly in circumstances the chronicles do not fully explain. A third, Ralph d'Assay, apparently survived, but was of limited usefulness. The men who had committed themselves to the young duke's survival found themselves in a world where that commitment could cost them everything. And the ones who maintained it despite the cost were demonstrating exactly the quality of loyalty that William would value and reward throughout his subsequent career. The turning point of William's minority came at the Battle of Valais Dunes in 1047, when he was approximately 19 years old. A coalition of Norman barons is led by Guy of Burgundy, who was William's cousin and had his own dynastic claim to the duchy, rose in rebellion against the young duke's authority in a revolt that threatened to end his rule entirely. William appealed to his overlord, King Henry I of France, who supported him. The French king had his own interest in preventing any single Norman lord from dominating the duchy and destabilizing the border, and the combined Franco-Norman force met the rebels at Val's Dunes near Caen. The battle was a Norman victory, and its result was the collapse of the most serious challenge to William's authority during the minority period. Val's Dunes was not the end of William's military challenges. The following decade was a period of almost constant warfare against the Count of Maine, to the south against the King of France himself, when Henry I's policy shifted from supporting to opposing the increasingly powerful Norman Duke against the rebellious barons of his own duchy, who continued to test the limits of their nominal submission. At the Battle of Mortimer in 1054 and the Battle of Varavaville in 1057, William defeated French royal invasions of Normandy with a tactical skill and a use of terrain that demonstrated military abilities well beyond what his youth would have suggested. The victory at Varaville in particular, where William caught the French army divided by a tidal crossing of the Dives River and destroyed the rear half before it could reunite with the advance, showed the opportunistic tactical intelligence that would characterize his greatest successes. The specific quality that the chronicles of this period attribute to William is not simply courage, though he had courage in abundance. It is the combination of courage with self-control, the ability to wait for the right moment, to resist the temptation to act before conditions were favorable, and then to move with decisive speed once the moment arrived. This combination, patience followed by explosion, is visible in everything from the careful preparation of the English invasion to the specific tactical situations of Mortimer and Varaville to the management of the conquest's aftermath. It is a rare combination in any military commander, and in a man whose childhood had given him every reason for the kind of reactive aggression that chronically threatened children sometimes develop. Its presence in William suggests something about the specific quality of the intelligence that the dangerous years had shaped. William survived his childhood through a combination of luck and the loyalty of a small group of supporters whose commitment to him was perhaps explained by exactly the qualities that his enemies used against him. The bastard son of a humble mother, precisely because he was not the product of any of the great Norman baronial families, was a lord whose advancement of his own position was not automatically a threat to any particular faction. The Norman lords who supported William through his minority were not, for the most part, acting out of idealism. They were acting out of the calculation that a weak, young, illegitimate duke was a useful instrument for their own purposes. They underestimated him. It was an underestimation that would prove consequential. The England that William would eventually conquer was in 1028 when he was born, and throughout the decades of his development as a ruler, a kingdom of considerable sophistication and considerable internal tension. To understand what he was taking and why it mattered, you need to understand what England actually was in the middle of the 11th century, which is to say you need to understand that it was one of the most administratively advanced kingdoms in Western Europe with a system of taxation, law, and royal governance that was more developed than anything in France or the German lands or anywhere in the Western Christian world, except possibly the revived Holy Roman Empire. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom that Harold Godwinson was defending at Hastings in October 1066 had its roots in the centuries of English history that followed the withdrawal of Roman authority in the early 5th century and the subsequent settlement of the island by the various Germanic peoples, Angles, Saxons, Jutes who gave the new order its character. The process had been violent and disruptive, replacing the Romano-British population of the lowlands with new settlers and new languages in ways that archaeological and linguistic evidence reflects, and that later medieval historians dramatized into a coherent narrative of conquest and transformation. By the 7th and 8th centuries, the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England had developed into stable political entities with their own legal traditions, their own ecclesiastical networks, and their own cultural achievements. Most spectacularly, the monasteries that produced in the works of Bede and Alcuin and their contemporaries some of the finest scholarship in the early medieval Western world. The 9th century brought the Vikings, and the impact of Viking raiding and eventual Viking settlement transformed the political landscape of Anglo-Saxon England in ways that the subsequent history of 1066 makes difficult to separate from the Norman story. The Danish Great Heathen army that invaded England in 865 and spent the following decades carving up the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms produced the specific crisis that Alfred of Wessex, Alfred the Great, transformed into the foundation of English national identity. Alfred's defense of Wessex against the Danes, his eventual settlement with the Danish leader Guthrum, the division of England into the Danelaw in the north and east under Danish control, and the English kingdoms in the south and west, and Alfred's systematic program of cultural and administrative renewal in his own kingdom, the schools, the translations, the reformed military organization, the burr system of defended towns that gave England a network of military strongpoints. Produced in the late 9th century, a Wessex-centered English kingdom that would, under Alfred's successors, expand northward to unite the whole of England under a single crown for the first time. This unified English kingdom fully achieved under Athlin in the early 10th century and maintained with varying degrees of effectiveness under the subsequent West Saxon dynasty, was the most sophisticated political entity in the British Isles and arguably in Northern Europe. The English system of taxation, the GEL, a land tax assessed on the basis of a unit called the hide, that represented a notional area of agricultural land, was the most reliable and most systematically administered fiscal system in the Western world outside of Byzantium. The English administrative system, the division of the country into shires governed by royal officers called sheriffs, the network of royal courts where the king's law was applied, the rich system by which royal commands were issued in writing to local officials, was an apparatus of governance more systematic and more penetrating than anything the Norman dukes had in their own territory. The English coinage system, with its regular cycles of minting and its royal control of the money supply, was the most sophisticated monetary system in the North. England was, in short, a kingdom worth having not merely for its territory and its agricultural wealth, which was substantial, but for the administrative machinery that extracted and organized that wealth with an efficiency that the medieval world rarely managed. The specific crisis of 1066 was not, however, primarily a constitutional or administrative crisis. It was a succession crisis, and understanding it requires going back to one of the more complicated family arrangements in early medieval European history. The Danish king Sinuit Canute, in the more familiar spelling, had conquered England in 1016 and ruled it until his death in 1035, creating for a brief period a North Sea empire that included England, Denmark, and Norway. Sinuit was an effective king of England who worked largely within the existing Anglo-Saxon administrative framework rather than replacing it, and his reign was not the catastrophe that might have been expected from a foreign conquest, but his death without a clear succession arrangement produced the usual chaos, and after a period of disputed rule, the West Saxon dynasty was restored in the person of Edward the Confessor, who ruled England from 1042 to 1066, was deeply pious, was apparently childless, and created through his childlessness the succession crisis that the 1066 was the violent resolution of. Edward the Confessor had spent much of his early life in Normandy, in exile during Knut's reign, and his Norman connections were genuine and personal. He brought Norman advisors, Norman clergy, and Norman cultural influences to England throughout his reign, generating hostility from the English aristocracy, especially from the most powerful of the English, Godwin of Wessex and his formidable family. The Godwin family dominated English political life in the 1040s and 1050s in ways that periodically reduced the king to something approaching a figurehead. And the conflict between Edward's Norman preferences and the Godwin family's English nationalism produced a political tension that ran through the entire second half of the reign. The question of who would succeed the childless Edward was the question that this tension eventually converged on. And the answer to that question was the cause of the War of 1066. William of Normandy's claim to the English throne was based on several foundations, not all of them equally solid. The most dynastic was the relationship between his great-aunt Emma of Normandy and the English royal house. Emma had been married successively to the English King Ethel the Unready and to the Danish King Nut, and through her, the Norman ducal house had a connection to the English royal family that was real but distant. More immediately, William claimed that Edward the Confessor had promised him the English succession during Edward's reign, that at some point in the 1050s, the King of England had sent an embassy to Normandy, acknowledging William as his designated heir. This claim cannot be definitively verified from the surviving evidence, but it was not implausible. Edward's Norman connections were real. William had already established himself as one of the most capable rulers in northern France, and the childless king may genuinely have considered designating a Norman successor as a way of managing the succession question. The most dramatic support for William's claim was the oath that Harold Godwinson himself had sworn. Harold, the most powerful of the English and the son of the late Godwin, had visited Normandy in the early 1060s. The precise circumstances of his visit remain disputed. Whether he went voluntarily on a diplomatic mission or was shipwrecked and fell into William's hands as a prisoner. And while he was there, he had sworn on sacred relics to support William's claim to the English throne. The oath was by the standards of the 11th century a binding commitment, and William's subsequent claim that Harold had purged himself by accepting the English crown after Edward's death was the moral and legal foundation of the Norman campaign. The Bayeux Tapestry, the extraordinary embroidered narrative of the conquest that was almost certainly produced in England within a generation of the events it depicts, shows Harold swearing the oath with his hands on relic and makes its visual argument for the moral weight of his subsequent perjury with considerable skill. Harold Godwinson's claim to the English throne was, in practical terms, the strongest of all. He was the most powerful nobleman in England. He had been effectively governing the kingdom alongside the increasingly infirm Edward. And on Edward's deathbed, according to the English sources, which are naturally partisan in his favor, the king commended the kingdom to his care. The Witan, the council of English nobles and clergy, who had the traditional authority to recognize a new king, chose Harold immediately following Edward's death in January 1066. And Harold was crowned in Westminster Abbey the same day. He was, from the English perspective, the legitimate King of England, chosen by the proper constitutional process and endorsed by the ecclesiastical establishment. From William's perspective, he was a perjurer who had stolen a throne he had promised to support another man's claim to, and the moral case for military intervention was correspondingly clear. But there was a third claimant in 1066, whose existence is sometimes overshadowed by the more famous confrontation between Harold and William, and who adds a dimension to the story that the two-sided narrative misses. Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway, claimed the English throne on the basis of an alleged agreement between earlier Scandinavian rulers, and he invaded. northern England in September 1066 with a substantial Norwegian fleet. Harold Hardrada was one of the great warriors of the Viking Age, a man who had served in the Varangian Guard of Byzantium and had fought across the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic with a ferocity and a military effectiveness that made him one of the most formidable military figures of his generation. His invasion of the north forced Harold Godwinson to march his army from London to Yorkshire at a pace that the chronicles describe with a kind of brevity that indicates genuine astonishment, covering the distance of nearly 200 meters in about 4 days. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September the 25th, 1066, Harold's army, fresh from its extraordinary march, fell on the Norwegian forces with a surprise and a violence that destroyed them entirely. Harold Hardrada was killed. The Norwegian fleet, which had sailed south with an enormous force, departed with the survivors in a fraction of the ships that had brought them. The chronicles record that the original fleet had required hundreds of ships, and the survivors needed fewer than 30. It was one of the most complete military victories in English history, and it accomplished in a single afternoon the elimination of the Norwegian threat that had been the third element of 1066's three-way succession crisis. Harold Godwinson had demonstrated in one battle that he was a commander of the First Order. 3 days later, on September the 28th, William's fleet landed on the Sussex coast. The crossing of the Norman fleet from the mouth of the Dives River to the English coast had been delayed for weeks by contrary winds, a delay that the Norman sources interpret as providential. God withholding the favorable wind until the moment was right, and that the military historian interprets as a period during which Harold's army, assembled on the south coast in expectation of exactly this invasion, had been forced to disperse because it could not be maintained indefinitely in the field. William had assembled an invasion force of remarkable size and complexity. The estimates of its strength vary widely in the sources, but the fleet that crossed the Channel numbered in the hundreds of ships carrying several thousand knights with their horses, thousands of infantry, engineers, and supporting troops, and the material for a sustained military campaign. This was not a raid. It was a conquest planned and organized, with the thoroughness of a man who had been thinking about England for years. The Norman force landed at Peveny on the Sussex coast and immediately began the systematic ravaging of the surrounding countryside. That was both a practical necessity the army had to eat and a deliberate military strategy. The devastation of Harold's own family estates in the region was intended to provoke the English king into an immediate response to draw him south before he could fully rest his army after Stamford Bridge, or assemble the additional forces that time would have allowed him to gather. The strategy worked, and whether it worked because Harold's temperament made him unable to endure the ravaging of his territory, or because his political position as the new king required him to be seen defending his kingdom, or because he genuinely misjudged the military situation, remains a subject of historical debate. Harold marched south from London. His army had been supplemented by some reinforcements gathered during the brief period between Stamford Bridge and the march south, but the core of it was still the force that had just fought and marched hard in the north. And the question of whether it was fully recovered from the physical demands of that campaign when it met the Normans at Hastings is one that the subsequent outcome makes poignant but cannot definitively resolve. He took up a position on a ridge at a place then called Senlac, about 7 miles north of Hastings on October 13th, 1066, with his army deployed in a shield wall along the crest of the ridge. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14th, 1066, lasted most of a day, and the specific tactical problem it presented to both sides illustrates why 1066 was not simply a matter of Norman military superiority overwhelming Anglo-Saxon backwardness. It was a genuine contest between two effective and different military systems whose outcome was not determined before the battle began. The Norman army that assembled at Hastings was organized around three arms: the heavy cavalry that was the shock weapon of the Norman military system, the infantry who supported and screened the cavalry and formed the attacking force for positions that the cavalry could not easily reach, and the archers whose missile fire was intended to disrupt and weaken the enemy formation before the cavalry closed. The coordination of these three arms, the archers softening the enemy line, the infantry pressing forward to keep the enemy occupied, the cavalry striking at the moment when the enemy line showed weakness, was the tactical system that the Normans had developed through decades of warfare in France and Italy. And it was a system of considerable sophistication for its period. The English army that Harold had deployed on the Senlac Ridge was at its best an equally sophisticated military instrument of a different kind. The House Carls, the professional warriors who served the king and the greats on a permanent basis, armed with the Danish great axe that was one of the most formidable hand weapons in the medieval arsenal, trained and experienced in the discipline of the shield wall, were the equal of any infantry in Europe. The shield wall they formed, locked shields overlapping, axes ready over the top of the wall, was a formation that had defeated Viking armies and that had just days earlier destroyed Harold Hardrada's Norwegian force at Stamford Bridge. On good ground, properly formed, the Anglo-Saxon shield wall was nearly impregnable to frontal cavalry assault. The horses would not charge into a solid wall of shields and weapons, and the Norman knights could not easily use their primary weapon. The momentum of the mounted charge against a formation that held its ground. The specific narrative of what happened at Hastings is worth working through carefully because the popular summary, Normans won English, lost the end misses the genuine drama and the specific decisions that determined the outcome. The battle opened with the Norman archers firing into the English formation on the ridge, an opening that produced limited results because the English were positioned above them and the arrows were largely deflected by the shield wall or fell short. The Norman infantry advanced up the slope and engaged the English line and was repelled. The English axes and the discipline of the shield wall made the slope a killing ground for attackers. The cavalry charges that followed were also repelled, the horses refusing to charge into the solid line of shields. The Norman knights unable to get the decisive breakthrough that their horses' momentum was supposed to deliver. At some point in the middle of the day, a portion of the Norman left. The Breton contingent fighting under the command of William's Breton allies broke and fled down the hill. The specific reasons for this are not clear. Genuine panic, the result of heavy casualties, or a deliberate feint ordered by William, who recognized that the retreat might draw English troops off the ridge. The Norman sources, writing in the knowledge of the eventual victory, describe it as a deliberate feint. The balance of historical opinion is that it began as a genuine retreat that William either ordered or recognized and turned to his advantage. What happened next is clear. A portion of the English force, the less disciplined 3rd Infantry on the right of the English line, or possibly men pursuing what they thought was a fleeing enemy, came down the slope in pursuit of the retreating Normans, broke the integrity of the shield wall, and were caught in the open by Norman cavalry who turned on them. The breach in the English line, once opened, was exploited. There followed several more hours of fighting, the English formation contracting as it suffered casualties and its flanks were progressively weakened. William reportedly having 3 horses killed under him in the fighting, the Norman attacks continuing until the late afternoon when Harold was killed and the English resistance finally collapsed. The battle was not a foregone conclusion at any point until the final hour or two. It was a genuinely hard-fought engagement whose outcome was determined by a combination of English tactical error, Norman tactical flexibility, and the specific death of Harold that removed the center of English command at the critical moment. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, lasted most of a day, which was unusual for medieval battles, which typically ended much more quickly when one side broke, or the initial shock of contact destroyed the cohesion of one of the formations. The English shield wall, the traditional Anglo-Saxon defensive formation in which dismounted warriors lock their shields together to present an unbroken front, was on its chosen ground enormously difficult to break by frontal assault. The Norman cavalry, charges that drove up the slope toward the English position, were repelled repeatedly through the morning and into the afternoon. The Norman knights unable to penetrate the wall of shields and axes, the English housecarls, the professional warriors who formed the backbone of Harold's force, fighting with a disciplined ferocity that showed why the English military system at its best was as effective as anything in the Western world. The tactical crisis of the battle came when a portion of the Norman force, it may have been a genuine retreat or it may have been a feigned one, and the Norman sources naturally claim it was deliberate, while the possibility that it began as a genuine retreat that William subsequently turned to his advantage is also plausible, fell back from the English line, and a portion of the English army, apparently the less disciplined, feared levies on the flanks, broke formation to pursue them. The pursuing English troops were caught in the open by Norman cavalry and destroyed. The breach in the English line, once opened, allowed the Norman cavalry and infantry to exploit the gap, and the integrity of the shield wall was broken. Harold Godwinson died at Hastings. The manner of his death has been argued about since the 11th century. The famous image in the bow tapestry of a figure pulling an arrow from his eye, or falling struck by an arrow. The image being ambiguous, perhaps the most debated two-dimensional representation in English art history. Whether he was killed by an arrow, by Norman knights who cut him down after the line broke, or by some combination of both, he died on the field, and with his death the English resistance collapsed. The Norman cavalry pursued the fleeing English into the dusk, and the Battle of Hastings was over. The aftermath of Hastings was not an immediate English submission. The English nobles, after a period of disorganization in which various alternatives were briefly considered, eventually approached William at London with the offer of the crown, and William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066 at Westminster Abbey, in a ceremony whose disturbing interruption, the Norman guards outside, mistaking the shout of acclamation inside for a riot, set fire to the surrounding buildings, and the ceremony continued inside amid the smell of smoke, while panicked crowds fled in the streets. Was perhaps an omen, or perhaps simply the chaotic result of nervous soldiers and an unfamiliar ritual. What followed over the next 5 years was not the peaceful consolidation of a completed conquest, and the specific stories of the resistance that William had to suppress illuminate both the genuine popular depth of the English opposition to the Norman takeover and the specific brutality with which William responded to it. The English resistance was not simply the uncoordinated reaction of a shocked population. It had leaders, it had geographical bases, and it had the potential to succeed. At several points in the first 5 years after Hastings, the Norman Conquest was genuinely at risk, the most famous of the English. Resistance leaders was Herwood, known to later tradition as Herwood the Wake, the watchful or the wakeful, an epithet that later legend applied to him, but that the contemporary sources do not use. Herwood was a Lincolnier thing who had been outlawed before the conquest and who returned after 1066 to find his family's lands in Norman hands. The details of his career are buried under layers of later legendary elaboration that make it difficult to separate the historical Herwood from the heroic figure that later English tradition made of him. But the core is solid. He led a resistance based in the fenlands of East Anglia, using the islands in the marshes as defensible bases, conducting raids on Norman positions and Norman settlers with considerable effectiveness. The great monastery of Ellely on its island in the fens became the center of the resistance in 1071, when the Danish fleet that was supporting the English rebels anchored at the Isle of Ellely, and the combination of English resistance, fighters and Danish allies made the position genuinely formidable. William's suppression of the Elley resistance was accomplished through engineering as much as military force. He built a causeway across the marshes to reach the island, denying the defenders the geographical advantage that the fens had provided, and then took the monastery by storm. The Danish fleet was bought off with tribute, as Danish fleets had been bought off throughout the history of English-Danish relations in the English. Resistance on the island collapsed. Hereward himself escaped, and here the historical record gives way to legend. The later tradition has him living as an outlaw in the Greenwood, continuing his resistance, eventually making peace with William on honorable terms, and dying peacefully in possession of his lands. The reality is likely more prosaic. He probably fled possibly to Flanders or Scotland and disappeared from the historical record. But the legend he became tells you something about the need of the conquered English population for a hero who had not entirely submitted. And Herwood served that need in a way that the documentary record's silence about his fate paradoxically supported. Edgar Ealing was the more dynastic focus of the English resistance, the young great-nephew of Edward the Confessor, who had been the obvious choice for the English throne in the immediate aftermath of Hastings if the English political community had been in a position to make that choice effectively. Edgar was probably about 14 or 15 at the time of the conquest, too young to command the kind of immediate personal authority that the crisis required. And the Witten's decision to approach William rather than crown Edgar reflected a pragmatic assessment of the military reality rather than any enthusiasm for the Norman claimant. Edgar went to Scotland, where he was sheltered by the Scottish King Malcolm III, who was married to Edgar's sister Margaret, a woman of remarkable personal quality who would eventually be canonized as Saint Margaret of Scotland. Edgar was involved in multiple, subsequent attempts to reclaim England with Scottish and Danish support, attempts that failed consistently but that occupied William's attention and military resources throughout the 1070s. The specific complexity of William's Scottish relationship illuminates one of the recurring problems of his reign. Scotland under Malcolm III was a kingdom that could not easily be ignored, but could not easily be conquered. A northern power whose support for the English resistance leadership was a persistent irritant, and whose raids into the north of England were a recurring threat to the stability of the border region. William's punitive campaign into Scotland in 1072, which reached as far north as the Firth of Tay, and extracted from Malcolm a formal submission, and the expulsion of Edgar Atheling from Scottish territory, was a demonstration of the reach of Norman military power, but it did not resolve the underlying tensions of the Scottish relationship, which would continue to generate crises long after William's reign. What does